Danny Sullivan sat beside the campfire and watched his grandfather poke at the burning logs with a long stick. The flames danced higher and sent orange light across the trees around their small clearing. 8 years old and already taller than most kids his age, Danny had his grandfather's green eyes and sandy, brown hair that never stayed flat no matter how much his grandfather tried to comb it down. "Tell me about the stars again, Grandpa Frank," Danny said as he pulled his sleeping bag closer around his shoulders. The Montana wilderness was cold at night, even in summer. Frank Sullivan smiled and set down his stick. At 72 years old? He moved slower than he used to, but his mind was still sharp as the day he retired from running the Pine Ridge Library. "Well, Danny boy, each one of those lights up there is a sun just like ours. Some of them have planets going around them. And maybe some of those planets have people living on them." Danny looked up at the sky full of stars. There were so many more here than back in town where the streetlights made everything dim. "Do you think they tell stories like we do?" "I bet they do," Frank said. "Stories are important things. They help us make sense of the world and remember what matters." He reached into his camping bag and pulled out a thick book. "Speaking of stories, how about we read another chapter of that adventure book before bed?" Danny was about to answer when something strange happened. The stars above them began to move. At first he thought maybe clouds were passing over, but the sky was clear. Then he realized the stars were not moving. Something big was blocking them out. "Grandpa, look up," Danny whispered. Frank looked up and his mouth fell open. 3 enormous shapes were coming down from the sky. They moved slowly and quietly like giant birds gliding on the wind, but these were not birds. As they got closer, Danny could see they looked like dragons from the storybooks his grandfather read to him. But these dragons were real, and they were bigger than anything Danny had ever imagined. The first dragon touched down at the edge of their clearing with surprising gentleness for something so massive. Its body was the size of a small house and covered in scales that looked like they were made of crystal and metal. The scales caught the firelight and threw it back in blues and greens and silvers. Along the dragon's neck and back, Danny could see strange devices that glowed with soft light. They looked like the computers he had seen at school, but much more advanced. The second dragon landed on the other side of their camp. This one was even larger than the first, with scales that shifted color as it moved. Its eyes glowed like stars themselves, bright and intelligent. Strange markings covered its wings, patterns that seemed to move and change when Danny looked at them. The third dragon settled down behind them, completing a circle around the small campfire. This dragon had what looked like metal plates along its spine and devices attached to its head that pulsed with gentle blue light. When it breathed, steam came from its nostrils, even though the night was not that cold. Frank made a choking sound and grabbed his chest. His face went pale and he fell backward onto his sleeping bag. "Frank, my heart," he gasped. Then his eyes closed and he stopped moving. "Grandpa!" Danny shouted and crawled over to where Frank lay. He shook his grandfather's shoulder but got no response. Frank was still breathing, but very slowly. Danny had learned about heart attacks in health class at school. He knew his grandfather needed help, but they were miles from town and he did not know how to drive the truck. The dragons watched all of this happen. They did not move closer, but Danny could feel them studying him and his grandfather. The largest dragon, the one behind them, made a low sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a song. The sound traveled through the ground and up into Danny's body. It did not hurt, but it felt strange, like when he put his hand on the speakers. At school during music class, Danny was scared, but he was also curious. The dragons could have hurt them already if they wanted to. Instead, they just watched and waited. The boy stood up slowly and looked at each dragon in turn. They were beautiful, in a way that made his chest feel tight with wonder. Their scales caught the starlight and their eyes held intelligence that reminded him of his grandfather when Frank was thinking about something important. "Hello," Danny said in a small voice. His grandfather had always told him to be polite to strangers. The dragons all turned their great heads toward him when he spoke. The closest dragon lowered its massive head until it was only a few feet from Danny. This close, The boy could see that the dragon's scales were not just pretty decorations. They moved slightly, like they were alive. The devices along its neck hummed softly. The dragon made another sound, different from the first one. This sound was higher and seemed to have patterns in it, like it was trying to say words. Danny listened carefully but could not understand what the dragon meant. "I don't know what you're saying," Danny told the dragon honestly. "But my grandpa is hurt and I need to help him." All three dragons made sounds at once. The noises mixed together into something that was almost like music. Danny felt the vibrations in his bones and suddenly understood something important. The dragons were not just making random noises. They were trying to talk to him. Danny sat down cross-legged in front of the nearest dragon. His grandfather always said that when you met someone new, the best thing to do was sit down and listen. Maybe the same thing worked with dragons. Danny, he said, pointing to himself. "That's my grandpa, Frank. We're humans from Earth." He pointed to his grandfather, then to the ground, then up at the sky. The dragon tilted its great head to one side like a curious dog. It made a softer sound this time, and Danny thought he heard something like sadness in it. The dragon's glowing eyes looked from Danny to Frank and back again. Danny realized that these dragons, wherever they came from, were trying to tell him something important. Maybe they needed help too. He thought about all the stories his grandfather had read to him about brave heroes who helped others in need. Maybe this was his chance to be brave. "Don't worry," Danny said to the dragons. "We'll figure this out together." Danny sat in the dirt and looked up at the three enormous dragons surrounding him and his unconscious grandfather. The campfire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the crystal scales that covered the dragons' bodies. Hours had passed since they first landed, and Danny could tell something was wrong with these magnificent creatures. The largest dragon, the one behind him, kept shifting its weight from foot to foot. Its great head moved back and forth like it was looking for something it could not find. The devices along its neck flashed faster now, pulsing with urgent blue light. The dragon made low rumbling sounds deep in its throat that sounded almost like whimpering. "Are you okay?" Danny asked the big dragon. He kept his voice soft and gentle, the same way his grandfather spoke to scared animals they sometimes found in the woods. When Danny spoke quietly, all three dragons turned toward him. Their movements became slower and more careful. The largest dragon stopped its restless shifting and lowered its head toward the boy. Its glowing eyes looked directly into Danny's, and the boy saw something there that surprised him. The dragon looked tired and sad. Danny tried speaking louder to see what would happen. "What's wrong with you guys?" Immediately, all three dragons pulled back. Their scales seemed to bristle and the devices on their bodies flashed brighter. The middle dragon spread its wings partway, and Danny could see the thin membranes were covered in the same shifting patterns as their scales. They made sharp, distressed sounds that hurt Danny's ears. Sorry, Danny said quickly, dropping his voice back to a whisper. "I won't yell anymore." The dragons settled down again, folding their wings close to their bodies. Danny was beginning to understand something important. These dragons could not understand his words, but they definitely responded to how he said things. When he spoke gently, they calmed down. When he raised his voice, they got upset. Danny crawled closer to his grandfather and checked on him. Frank was still breathing steadily, but he had not woken up. Danny knew he should probably try to get help, but the nearest town was 20 miles away through dark forest roads. He did not know how to drive, and he could not leave his grandfather alone with the dragons, even if they seemed friendly. "I wish you could tell me what's wrong," Danny said to the dragons. "Maybe I could help." The largest dragon made another sound, this one different from all the others. It was a complex noise with rises and falls like music, but sadder than any song Danny had ever heard. As the dragon made this sound, Danny felt something strange happen in his head. For just a moment, he saw flashes of images that were not his own memories. He saw vast spaces between stars, cold and empty and endless. He saw the inside of giant ships where dragons like these ones lay curled up but could not sleep. He saw The same dragons flying through strange skies above alien worlds, always searching for something they could not find. Most of all, he felt a deep tiredness that went beyond just being sleepy. It was like being homesick, but for a home that no longer existed. The vision lasted only a few seconds before it faded, leaving Danny blinking in confusion. But he understood now. These dragons were not just tired in their bodies. They were tired in their minds and hearts. They wanted to rest, really rest, but something was stopping them. "You can't sleep, can you?" Danny asked. "That's why you're sad." All three dragons made sounds at once, and Danny felt their emotions wash over him like waves. Loneliness, frustration, and a desperate need for something they had lost long ago. The boy's heart ached for these beautiful creatures who had traveled so far but could not find peace. Danny looked around their campsite and saw his grandfather's book lying open beside the fire. It was one of Danny's favorites, a story about a boy who sailed to an island full of wild monsters and became their king. Frank had been reading it to Danny every night of their camping trip. An idea came to Danny then. Something his grandfather had done for him many times when Danny had trouble sleeping. When Danny had nightmares or felt scared at bedtime, Frank would sit beside his bed and read stories in a calm, soothing voice. The stories always helped Danny relax and drift off to peaceful dreams. "Maybe you need someone to read to you," Danny said to the dragons. "My grandpa always reads to me when I can't sleep." Danny picked up the book and opened it to the first page. The dragons watched him with intense curiosity. Their glowing eyes followed his movements as he settled into a comfortable position near the fire. "Where the Wild Things Are," by Morris Sendak, Danny began, reading the title slowly and clearly. He had heard this story so many times he almost knew it by heart. The night Max wore his Volf suit and made mischief of one kind and another, his mother called him Wild Thing and Max said, "I'll eat you up." So he was sent to bed without eating anything. As Danny read, something amazing happened. The dragons began to settle down around him. The largest dragon lowered its massive body to the ground and curled its tail around the campsite like a protective wall. The other two dragons also lay down, their great heads resting on their front legs. The urgent flashing of their technological devices slowed to a gentle, steady pulse. Danny continued reading, putting all the expression into his voice that his grandfather always used. He made his voice deep and growly when he read about the wild things, and soft and gentle when he read about Max's journey home. The dragons listened to every word, their eyes never leaving the boy's face. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all, Danny read. As he spoke these words, he felt another wave of emotion from the dragons. This time it was not sadness, but something like hope. When Danny finished the story, the dragons were completely still. Their breathing had become deep and regular. The devices along their bodies glowed with a soft, peaceful light that reminded Danny of nightlights in children's bedrooms. For the first time since they had landed, the dragons looked truly relaxed. "Did you like that?" Danny asked softly. The largest dragon opened one glowing eye and made a sound so quiet Danny almost missed it. But this sound was different from all the others. It was warm and grateful, like a cat's purr but deeper and more musical. Danny smiled and reached for another book from his grandfather's bag. Danny reached into his grandfather's camping bag and pulled out another book. The three dragons around him had settled into comfortable positions after listening to the first story, but their eyes remained fixed on the young boy. The campfire had burned low, so Danny added another log and watched the flames leap higher, casting warm light across the dragon's crystalline scales. "This one is about a bear named Paddington," Danny said, opening the new book. "He comes from Peru and loves marmalade sandwiches." As Danny began to read, he noticed something wonderful happening. The technological devices along the dragon's bodies, which had been flashing with urgent blue light, began to pulse more slowly. The largest dragon's breathing became deeper and more relaxed. Even more amazing, Danny could feel a sense of peace flowing from the creatures that he had not felt before. Paddington was a very unusual bear, Danny read. He had come all the way from darkest Peru with only a jar of marmalade, a suitcase, and his hat. While Danny read, bright lights appeared in the sky above them. At first he thought they might be shooting stars, but these lights were moving in patterns and getting larger. More dragons were coming down from somewhere high above the earth. These new dragons were different sizes and colors, but they all had the same crystal scales and glowing technological devices as the first three. The new dragons landed quietly around the edges of the clearing. Soon there were 7, then 10, then 15 enormous creatures forming a large circle around Danny and his grandfather. Each dragon settled down and listened as Danny continued reading about Paddington's adventures. In London, Danny was not scared by all the new dragons. Something about their behavior told him they meant no harm. They reminded him of children gathering around a teacher at story time in school. Their great heads were tilted forward, and their glowing eyes watched Danny with complete attention. As dawn began to lighten the sky, Danny's grandfather stirred and opened his eyes. Frank looked around at all the dragons surrounding them and blinked several times, as if he thought he might be dreaming. "Danny?" Frank whispered. "Are you all right?" "Boy, I'm okay, Grandpa," Danny said, pausing in his reading. "These dragons are sick, and I think stories are helping them feel better." Frank sat up slowly, holding his chest where it still hurt from his heart attack. He looked at the dragons more carefully, studying their faces and body language. As a librarian, Frank had spent his whole life learning to understand what people needed, and these dragons clearly needed something important. "They look tired," Frank observed. "Not just sleepy tired, but tired deep down in their souls." The largest dragon, who seemed to be the leader, turned its great head toward Frank. The dragon made a complex series of sounds, and suddenly Frank gasped. His eyes went wide, and he grabbed Danny's hand. "What is it, Grandpa?" Danny asked. "The dragon just put pictures in my mind," Frank said with wonder. "I can see their history, Danny. These creatures have been traveling between the stars for thousands of years, but they lost something important along the way. They forgot how to rest their minds." Frank struggled to his feet and walked closer to the leader dragon. "Your people once told stories to each other," he said to the great creature. "Long ago, before you built your ships and left your home world, you shared tales that brought peace to your spirits. But somewhere in all your traveling and conquering, you stopped telling stories. Now your minds cannot find rest." The dragon nodded its massive head and made a sound that was almost like crying. All the other dragons around the clearing echoed the sound, creating a harmony of sadness that made Danny's heart ache. "The condition has a name," Frank continued, somehow understanding what the dragons were telling him. "You call it mind scatter. It affects your entire species. Your thoughts race and spin without the anchor of stories to give them meaning and rest." Danny looked around at all the beautiful suffering creatures. "But I've been reading to them, and it seems to help." "That's because human stories have something your people forgot," Frank said to the dragons. "We create patterns of meaning that your minds recognize even though you don't understand our words. The rhythm and emotion of storytelling speaks to something deeper than language." The smallest dragon in the group, one with scales that shifted from purple to silver, crawled closer to Danny. This dragon was still enormous, but younger looking than the others. When it made sounds, the noises were higher and more musical. "This one wants to try something," Frank translated. "Her name is Xylee, and she thinks she might remember a story from when she was very young." Xylee lowered her head until she was very close to Danny. The boy could see his reflection in her large, gentle eyes. She began to make a series of sounds that were different from the others. These sounds had a definite pattern, rising and falling like a song or poem. As Xylee made her sounds, Danny began to see images in his mind. He saw a young dragon, much smaller than Xylee was now, sitting with an older dragon under strange purple stars. The older dragon was telling a story without words, sharing pictures and feelings directly from mind to mind. The story was about brave dragons who flew through dangerous storms to bring light to dark worlds. "She remembers," Danny said excitedly. "Xylee is telling me a story her mother told her when she was little." All the other dragons turned toward Xylee with intense interest. As she continued her wordless story, the other dragons began to make soft sounds of recognition and approval. Danny could feel waves of emotion from all of them, but this time the feelings were good ones. Hope, joy, and something like coming home after a long journey. When Xylee finished her story, the other dragons were silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, they began to make their own sounds. Each dragon was trying to remember stories from their own past, sharing fragments of tales that had been buried under centuries of technology and conquest. Frank smiled and sat down beside Danny. "You've done something amazing, grandson. You've helped an entire species remember what they lost. Stories aren't just entertainment. They're medicine for minds that have forgotten how to dream." The sun rose fully over the mountains, and Danny realized that for the first time since the dragons had arrived, they all looked truly peaceful. By noon, the sky above Pine Ridge looked like something from a science fiction movie. Danny counted at least 50 enormous shapes moving through the clouds, all heading toward their small clearing in the Montana wilderness. The dragons in the sky were different sizes and colors, but they all had the same crystal scales and glowing devices as the ones already on the ground. "Word is spreading through their fleet," Frank said, watching the sky with amazement. "Every dragon up there is hearing about what you've done, Danny. They're all coming to listen." Danny felt both excited and nervous as more dragons landed around them. The clearing was no longer big enough to hold them all, so the new arrivals settled in the trees and on the hillsides. Some dragons perched on rocky outcrops like giant birds, while others simply hovered in the air with wings that moved so slowly they seemed to be floating by magic. The largest dragon, who Frank had learned was called Korvax Prime, lifted his great head and made a long, complex series of sounds. Danny could not understand the dragon's language, but he felt the meaning through the strange mental connection they all seemed to share. Korvax was calling to all the dragons, telling them about the small human boy who possessed something their kind had forgotten. "He's asking them to be patient and take turns," Frank translated. "There are too many dragons here for you to help them all at once." Danny looked around at the sea of huge, beautiful creatures surrounding them. Each dragon's eyes held the same desperate hope he had seen in the first three. They had traveled across the galaxy and conquered countless worlds, but they could not conquer the sadness in their own minds. "I'll do my best," Danny said, "but I only have a few books with me." "Don't worry about that," Frank said with a smile. "I think we can ask these dragons to share their own stories too. That might be even better medicine than our human books." As if to prove Frank's point, Xylee crawled forward and began making her musical sounds again. This time she told a different story, one about young dragons learning to fly among the stars of their homeworld. As she shared her wordless tale, Danny watched the other dragons' faces change. The tired, desperate look in their eyes began to fade, replaced by something Danny recognized from children at the library when Frank read to them. They looked like they were remembering how to wonder, while the dragons shared stories with each other. Danny heard a new sound in the distance. It was not the musical calls of the dragons, but the mechanical noise of helicopters and airplanes. Human aircraft were approaching from the south, and they were coming fast. "Military," Frank said grimly. "Someone must have reported all these dragons. The government is sending people to investigate." The dragons heard the approaching aircraft too, but they did not seem worried. Korvax Prime made a dismissive sound and waved one massive paw in the direction of the human aircraft. The other dragons did not even look up from their storytelling circle. It was clear that they considered human military technology to be no threat at all. 3 large helicopters landed in a nearby field, and Danny watched soldiers in uniforms climb out. They carried weapons and serious expressions, but they moved carefully when they saw the massive dragons spread across the landscape. Leading them was a tall woman with short gray hair and stars on her uniform. "That's a general," Frank said. "Her name is Patricia Wells. I remember reading about her in the newspaper. She's in charge of defending against threats from space." General Wells approached the edge of the clearing with a small group of soldiers behind her. She stopped when she was still far enough away to run if needed, but close enough to see Danny and Frank clearly. "I'm General Wells with the United States Air Force," she called out. "Are you two civilians all right?" "We received reports of an alien landing. We're fine," Frank called back. "Better than fine, actually? These dragons are not here to hurt anyone?" General Wells looked around at the dozens of enormous creatures surrounding them. Most of the dragons were paying no attention to the human soldiers. They were too busy listening to stories and sharing their own recovered memories. "Sir, with respect, those are clearly hostile alien forces," one of the soldiers said to General Wells. "We should establish a perimeter and call for reinforcements." "Actually, they're not hostile at all," Danny said, walking closer to the general. "They're sick and we're helping them get better." General Wells stared at the 8-year-old boy who was calmly approaching her while surrounded by creatures that could probably destroy entire cities. "Son, I think you should come with us where it's safe. These aliens could be dangerous." "They're not aliens," Danny said seriously. "I mean, they are from space, but they're not scary. They're just sad because they forgot how to tell stories. My grandpa and I are teaching them to remember." As if to demonstrate Danny's point, a medium-sized dragon with blue and silver scales approached the group of soldiers. The dragon lowered its head and made gentle sounds, the same way it would greet other dragons. Several soldiers raised their weapons, but General Wells held up her hand to stop them. "Wait," she said. "Look at its body language. That's not aggressive behavior." The dragon continued making soft sounds and actually lay down in front of the soldiers, showing that it meant no harm. Then it began making the musical pattern that Danny recognized as storytelling. Through their mental connection, Danny could see the story the dragon was sharing. It was about peaceful contact between different species, about learning and growing together instead of fighting. "General Wells," Danny said, "this dragon is telling you a story about friendship. They don't want to fight anybody. They just want to learn how to be happy again." General Wells lowered her weapon and studied the dragon more carefully. As a military leader, she had trained her whole career to recognize threats, but nothing about these creatures seemed threatening. They were clearly advanced enough to destroy human civilization if they wanted to, but instead they were sitting in circles sharing stories like children at summer camp. Korvax Prime approached the general and began making the complex sounds that Frank had learned to interpret. As the dragon leader spoke, General Wells's eyes grew wide. "He's talking to me," she said with wonder. "I can see pictures in my mind. He's showing me their history, their travels, their sickness. He's asking for something." Frank nodded. "What is he asking for?" General Wells listened for several more minutes as Korvax Prime continued his soundless communication. When the dragon finished, the general looked stunned. "He wants to make a formal request to our government," she said slowly. "The dragons want to stay here and learn about human storytelling. In exchange, they're offering to share their advanced technology with us. They say they've found something more valuable than conquest, and they want to study it." Danny smiled up at the general. "See? They just want to be friends and share stories. That's not scary at all." 6 months later, Danny Sullivan walked through what had once been the quiet town of Pine Ridge, Montana. The place looked completely different now, but in the best possible way. Where there used to be empty fields, beautiful buildings made of human steel and dragon crystal rose toward the sky. The structures seemed to glow from within, casting rainbow patterns on the ground when the sun hit them just right. "Danny, there you are," called a familiar voice. Frank Sullivan walked toward his grandson with a big smile on his face. The old librarian looked healthier than he had in years. The dragon healers had fixed his heart problems completely, and their advanced medicine had given him energy he had not felt since he was a young man. "How did the morning session go, Grandpa?" Danny asked. He was taller now and his voice had started to change, but his green eyes still held the same wonder they had that night in the forest. "Wonderful," Frank said. "We had dragons from the Andromeda Galaxy listening to human fairy tales, and 3 of them shared stories from their own childhood. Dr. Martinez is recording everything for the cultural database." Danny nodded and looked around at the amazing place Pine Ridge had become. The Pine Ridge Institute for Narrative Sciences was now the most important place on Earth for studying the power of stories. Humans and dragons worked together here every day, learning from each other and creating new kinds of tales that neither species could have imagined alone. Danny walked toward the main storytelling amphitheater, a massive round building that could hold 1,000 dragons and humans at the same time. The walls were made of dragon crystal that could project any image or sound the storytellers needed. Human technology and dragon science had combined to create something magical inside the amphitheater. Danny saw his friend Xylee practicing a new story. The young dragon had become an expert at sharing tales that combined dragon memories with human narrative structures. Her scales now shimmered with patterns that moved in time with her stories, creating visual art that matched her words. "Hello, Danny," Xylee said, her voice coming through the translation devices that dragon scientists had created. The machines could turn dragon sounds into human speech and human words into dragon harmonics. "Are you ready for today's big presentation?" Danny felt nervous butterflies in his stomach. Today was special because representatives from 12 different alien species were coming to Pine Ridge to learn about storytelling. Word had spread across the galaxy that humans possessed something remarkable, something that could heal minds and bring peace to entire civilizations. "I think so," Danny said. "But there are going to be so many different kinds of aliens there. What if they don't understand our stories?" Korvax Prime entered the amphitheater, moving with the grace that all dragons had learned since rediscovering their storytelling heritage. The great dragon leader had become like a grandfather to Danny, always offering wisdom when the boy felt overwhelmed by his important role. "Do not worry, young storybringer," Korvax said through his translator. "Stories speak to something deeper than species or language. You proved that when you first helped us remember what we had lost." General Wells walked into the amphitheater, wearing a dress uniform covered in medals. She had become the Earth's official liaison to alien species, and her job was to make sure that the peaceful contact with the dragons led to good relationships with other species too. "The visiting delegations are arriving now," General Wells announced. "We have crystalline beings from the Vega system, energy creatures from a nebula near Orion, and several species that don't have physical bodies at all. This is going to be the most diverse gathering in galactic history." Danny took a deep breath and walked to the center of the amphitheater. A crowd of humans and dragons filled the seats, but now they were joined by creatures Danny had never seen before. Some looked like living gemstones, others were floating balls of light, and a few were so strange that Danny could not even describe them. "Welcome, everyone," Danny said, his voice carried by the translation systems to every being in the amphitheater. 6 months ago, I was just a kid on a camping trip with my grandpa. I never imagined that reading bedtime stories could change the galaxy." The dragons in the audience made their musical sounds of agreement, while the other aliens responded in their own ways. The crystalline beings chimed like bells, the energy creatures pulsed with different colors, and the non-physical species created patterns in the air that looked like words made of starlight. "Today we want to share with you a new kind of story," Danny continued. "It's not a human story or a dragon story. It's a story that all of us created together, about what happens when different species choose to be friends instead of enemies." Xylee moved to stand beside Danny, her scales glowing with excitement. Frank joined them too, carrying a special book that contained the new collaborative story they had all been working on. "This story is called The Star Bridge," Frank announced. "It's about a young human boy who met some sad dragons and discovered that the most powerful force in the universe is not technology or weapons, but the simple act of sharing stories." As Frank began to read, Danny watched the faces of all the different alien species. Some had faces that looked almost human, others had no faces at all, but every single being in the amphitheater was paying attention with the same focused interest that he had seen in those first 3 dragons months ago. The story told of how a small act of kindness had grown into something that brought peace to an entire galaxy. It spoke of different species learning that their differences made them stronger, not weaker. It explained how stories could build bridges between any minds. No matter how alien they seemed to each other, when Frank finished reading, the amphitheater was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, each species began to respond in their own way. The dragons sang their harmonious songs, the humans clapped and cheered, the crystalline beings created musical chimes, and the energy creatures painted the air with beautiful colors. An ancient being made of pure thought projected words directly into everyone's minds. "We have traveled for eons seeking wisdom and power," the being said. "But these humans have shown us that the greatest magic is the ability to touch another's soul with words and dreams." Annie smiled and looked around at all the amazing creatures who had come to learn about stories. "My grandpa always told me that stories help us make sense of the world and remember what matters. I think what matters most is that we're all here together, sharing our dreams and making new friends." As the day ended and the alien visitors prepared to return to their homeworlds, each species promised to establish storytelling traditions in their own societies. The dragons had started something that would spread across the entire galaxy, and it had all begun with a scared little boy reading bedtime stories under the Montana stars. Danny Sullivan had learned that sometimes the biggest adventures begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and that every person has the power to change the universe one story at a time.